Nice of you to join me. What we're doing is going into the link between capitalism and Protestantism. Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism is a study of the relationship between the ethics of ascetic Protestantism and the emergence of the spirit of modern capitalism. He argues the modern spirit of capitalism sees profit as an end in itself and pursuing profit as virtuous. Was that The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism? Summary Spark Notes. So that's, it looks like it's www.sparknotes.com. So that's the first one. Let's go there. Sparknotes.com. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, summary, sparknotes.com. Summary: Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism is a study of the relationship between the ethics of ascetic Protestantism and the emergence of the spirit of modern capitalism. Weber argues that the religious ideas of groups such as the Calvinists played a role in creating the capitalistic spirit. Weber first observes a correlation between being Protestant and being involved in business and declares his intent to explore religion as a potential cause of the modern economic conditions. He argues that the modern spirit of capitalism sees profit as an end in itself and pursuing profit as virtuous. Weber's goal is to understand the source of this spirit. He turns to Protestantism for a potential explanation. Protestantism offers a concept of the worldly calling and gives worldly activity a religious character. While important, this alone cannot explain the need to pursue profit. One branch of Protestantism, Calvinism, does provide this explanation. Calvinists believe in predestination, that God has already determined who is saved and damned. As Calvinism developed, a deep psychological need for clues about whether one was actually saved arose, and Calvinists looked to their success in worldly activity for those clues. Thus they came to value profit and material success as signs of God's favour. Other religious groups such as the Pietists, Methodists and the Baptist sects had similar attitudes to a lesser degree. Weber argues that this new attitude broke down the traditional economic system, paving the way for modern capitalism. However, once capitalism emerged, the Protestant values were no longer necessary and their ethic took on a life of its own. We are now locked into the spirit of capitalism because it is so useful for modern economic activity. Throughout his book, Weber emphasizes that his account is incomplete. He is not arguing that Protestantism caused the capitalistic spirit, but rather that it was one contributing factor. He also acknowledges that capitalism itself had an impact on the development of the religious ideas. The full story is much more complex than Weber's partial account, and Weber himself constantly reminds his readers about his own limitations. The book itself has an introduction and 5 chapters. The first 3 chapters make up what Weber calls the problem. The first chapter addresses religious affiliation and social stratification, the second the spirit of capitalism, and the third Luther's conception of the calling and the task of the investigation. The 4th and 5th chapters make up the practical ethics of the ascetic branches of Protestantism. The 4th chapter is about the religious foundations of worldly asceticism, and the 5th chapter is about asceticism and the spirit of capitalism. Next section, popular pages, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Review quiz. Oh, they do a quiz. Take a study break. Every book on your English syllabus summed up in a quote from The Office. Oh, really? Greek mythology, load of fuck. Review quiz. I'm needing a possible study break myself. It's dreadfully boring. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Max Weber. Summary, terms, further study, writing help, summary context. I'll get out of the way, I can't read it. I'm gonna cry. German sociologist and economist Max Weber, 1864 to 1920, published his most famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, in 1904 to 1905. Oh, that's the same time as Einstein was doing his The Theory of Relativity. There's micro and macro. Weber's writings and theories helped establish the foundations of modern sociology. Some of his other famous works include Objectivity in Social Science, Science-ification, Politics-ification, and the Theory of Social and Economic Cooperation. His account of bureaucracy as an essential feature of modern society has been highly influential. Weber was influenced by Karl Marx's writings, although he was not a Marxist, and actually criticizes aspects of Marx's theory in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism argues that the spirit that defines capitalist institutions has its roots in the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation was a 16th century religious movement that led to a creation of Protestantism, beginning with the protests of Martin Luther against the Catholic Church in 1517. Luther argued that people could be saved through faith alone, and this doctrine is one of the basic tenets of Lutheranism. Another Protestant religion that figures prominently in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism is Calvinism. Rooted in the ideas of John Calvin, Calvinism was based on the doctrine of predestination, that individual salvation was preordained by God. Calvinism is an ancestor of modern-day Presbyterianism. Next section, Introduction. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Max Weber, Study Guide, Summary Introduction. Weber begins his study with a question. What about Western civilization has made it the only civilization to develop certain cultural phenomena to which we like to attribute universal value and significance? Only in the West does science that we consider valid exist. While empirical knowledge and observation exist elsewhere in science, history, art and architecture, they lack the rational, systematic and specialized methodology of the West. In particular, the development of bureaucracy and the trained official are unique to the West, as is the modern rational state. The same is true of capitalism. It is important to understand that capitalism is not the same thing as the pursuit of gain and the greatest possible amount of money. Rather, capitalism implies the pursuit of forever renewable profit. Everything is done in terms of balances, the amount of money gained in a business period over the amount of money spent. The point is that economic action is based on the amount of profit made. Now, in this sense, capitalism has occurred in every civilization. However, the West has currently developed capitalism to a degree and in forms that have never existed elsewhere. This new form is the rational capitalistic organization of, formerly, free labor. This form reflects rational industrial organization, the separation of business from the household and rational bookkeeping. This form reflects rational industrial organization, the separation of business from the household and rational bookkeeping. However, ultimately these things are only significant in their association with the capitalistic organization of labor. Exact calculation, the basis of everything else, is only possible on the basis of free labor. Therefore, the problem for us is not the development of capitalistic activity, but is rather the roots of this sober bourgeois capitalism with its rational organisation of free labour. In terms of cultural history, it is to understand the development of the Western bourgeois class and its peculiarities. Weber says that we must try to understand what it was about the West that encouraged the technical utilisation of scientific knowledge through things like bookkeeping. Similarly, we must ask where the rational law and administration of the West came from. Why didn't the political, artistic, scientific or economic development of other countries follow the same path of rationalisation? Our first concern then is to work out and explain the peculiarity of Western rationalism. The correlation between this rationalism and the Western economic conditions must not be ignored in either direction. This work begins by looking at the influence of certain religious ideas on the development of an economic spirit, in this case the connection between the spirit of modern capitalism and the rational ethics of ascetic Protestantism. In looking at economic ethics in the world religions, Weber hopes to find points of comparison with the West. He observed that such investigations are necessarily limited by his lack of specialization in these areas. This cannot be avoided in doing comparative work. While some people think that specialization is unnecessary, Weber argues that dilettantism could be the end of science. He also says that he will avoid talking about the relative value of the cultures he studies. He also admits that while there is much to be said for the argument that many of the differences of culture have to do with hereditary, he does not see a way as yet of measuring its influence. Thus he believes that sociology and history have the job of analysing all of the causal relationships due to reactions to environment. Commentary. This introduction gives a sense of the breadth of Weber's overall interests and studies. His book is a study of the ways in which the values of ascetic Protestantism contributed to the development of the spirit of capitalism. However, he argues that there are also causal links between the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism that run the other way. Furthermore, he links the development of modern capitalism with a larger rationalisation of the Western world, which is itself a matter of great interest. He also declares his interest in comparing the role of Protestantism in developing culture with the role of other world religions. Weber also pursues many of these ideas, among others, in other writings. It is worth noting, then, that Weber saw the Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism as only the tip of the iceberg in the study of the complex interrelations among religion, rationalisation, and social and economic institutions. Precisely because of his understanding of this complexity, his conclusions are typically cautious and limited in scope. He encourages a flexible method of analysis which uses different perspectives in order to gain a fuller picture of social reality. This introduction also suggests a bit about Weber's approach to sociology. He is analysing unique formulations of social institutions, looking at the ways in which certain contingent ideas affect the development of capitalism. Thus he assumes that all societies are on different paths. He does not believe in one universal path of progress that all civilizations are currently on, but rather argues for the particularity of culture. This is quite different from many of the popular theories of his time. For example, according to Marxism, history is on an inevitable path, and the development of capitalism was not culturally contingent. Weber rejects such universalism and sees the Western experience as due to specific cultural developments. God, it does go on. It must be at least about 20 minutes. Religious affiliation and social stratification is the next section. God help us. Popular pages, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. God help us, I need a rest. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. What does YouTube have to say? A Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Who's that? Oh, how funny. I hope I've got some. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism.
Modern capitalism is not characterized by the drive to make as much money as you can, but by the wish to gradually increase your profits in a controlled, calculated, goal-rational way. The modern entrepreneur wants to create a predictably increasing flow of profits, and he tries to realize this by organizing his enterprise in a completely rational way. Now, the strange thing is that this hard-working capitalist never enjoys the fruits of his labor. He may succeed in generating this ever-growing stream of money, but he continues to lead an ascetic life. This surprising combination leads to the expansion of capitalism, because the profits now are pumped back, so to speak, into the enterprise, as they are not needed for more frivolous purposes. This spirit of capitalism leads to a flowering capitalism, and it is also produced by capitalism. But how did this capitalist spirit come into existence in the first place? We can already find it in Western Europe in the 16th century, before the serious takeoff of modern capitalism. And here Weber presents his famous thesis, according to which the Protestant ethic had an important influence on the spirit of capitalism in its earliest phase. In the 16th and in the 17th century, a new kind of Christian faith made its way in northwestern Europe and in the United States. This, of course, is the age of the rise of Protestantism. The Protestant doctrine teaches that we all have to work very hard because God wants us to make this world a better place. It is our moral duty to leave this world in a better state than the state in which we found it. And we should certainly not indulge in luxury. So here we see, at the moment when capitalism is only just beginning to take shape, the outlines of a new economic mentality that is consonant with the capitalist ethos of hard work plus an ascetic lifestyle. Part of the Weberian argument here is concerned with the doctrine of predestination. According to the strict interpretations in some Protestant churches, there is no way of finding out whether you belong to the small group of the chosen people, the elect, who will be admitted into heaven. The fear of eternal damnation became so violent among the believers that in some churches this doctrine was softened a bit. If you discover that you are the kind of person that loves to work extremely hard, if you are very, very successful in your work, if you don't spend much of your money, then you have good reason to assume that you belong to the chosen few. Now, this somewhat watered down version of Protestantism led to this striking outpouring of entrepreneurial energy. You could say that those dedicated Protestant entrepreneurs were driven by deep religious, metaphysical hopes and fears. Weber's thesis is really more complex and subtle than that. And, you know, my advice, and I really mean this, my advice is you should read the entire book. It's one of the most beautiful books in the sociological tradition. And among the books written by Max Weber, it is also his most accessible work. it is interesting to compare the approach of religion by Marx and the argument by Weber. Sometimes it is suggested that Weber took Marx's theory and turned it upside down. Where Marx believes that the arrow of causality points from the economic infrastructure towards the superstructure, and the superstructure of course also includes religious belief systems, Weber gives us the mirror image and says that it is in fact the Protestant religion that produced the mentality that was a necessary condition for modern capitalism to develop. But that is not quite the case. That's a bit an exaggeration. Weber writes that the arrows of causality point in both directions. There is a mutual interaction going on between the religious sector and the economic sector of society. But then he says, Karl Marx has been so very one-sided in stressing over and over and over again the importance of the underlying economic elements that now I want to show that you can also discern a causal arrow that points just the other way. So I believe that we should not see Weber's book as a refutation of Marx's analysis, but more as an extension of and as an addition to the argument that was given to us by Karl Marx.
Also, I would like to spend a couple of minutes kind of wrapping up some issues about the four authors what we covered in the text, right? Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and Weber.
Why the hell would you be throwing them together? They were all alive. They might have all met each other. What about Hegel?
I go into Max Weber, there's a lot I want to cover today. Would love to talk a lot about his life, I don't have time. I could give you a lot of nice and juicy stories. Unfortunately, I have to withhold myself. Okay, so the four authors.
We're in the section on religion. I want to use one of the classic studies in sociology that's been discussed for an incredible amount of time. And it's based upon research done by famous sociologist named Max Weber. Looks like Max Weber, but you know, if I could reach the camera and kind of slack it a little bit, if you said Max Weber, it's Max Weber, a good German boy. Max Weber wrote a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And capitalism, of course, is what? It's the free market economy where we can buy things as cheaply as we can, we can sell them as expensively as we can. And it's been credited with the incredible spread of lots of material things, lots of people living lots of better. Lots of indoor plumbing and all kinds of stuff. If you look at the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, it comes out of the whole idea of the sociology of religion. And you might be sitting there asking yourself, well, how can sociologists study religion? My religious beliefs are mine and they have no right to say anything about them. Well, you're absolutely right. We can't study religion to tell you who's going to heaven and who isn't. We can't even study religion to tell you if there's a God or not. Those are personal beliefs that we have or you have. What can sociologists study? Very clearly, what we study is the impact of religious beliefs and religious behavior on people. That's all we're studying. So, Karl Marx, the atheist, the guy who advocated for the overthrow of capitalism, had argued that religion was the drug or the opiate, the heroin of the people. He said that rich people manipulated religion to keep poor people poor and to keep them happy while they're poor. If they dream of the rewards being in heaven, then, they can not be as likely to revolt, not be as likely to demand religion. It's very negative. It was religion is the opiate of the people. Max Weber spent a great deal of his time disagreeing with Karl Marx on his ideas and doing research that backed him up. And this is one more of those examples. Max Weber disagrees dramatically with Karl Marx. No doubt religion has at times been used to oppress people, but Max Weber makes the point that religion has also caused change, social change itself. Instead of just retarding social change, keeping the rich rich, that religion has often been used as a major source of religious pressure to move things in a new direction, sometimes positive, sometimes not, perhaps. Well, Max Weber looked at this idea, and he looked at the Protestant Reformation, the big change from
The Pastor Reformation. I love it.
spread like wildfire.
It's Pastor Reformation.
And he came to some startling conclusions. So let's kind of back up just a little bit to give some background to make this argument. If, for example, we measure in 2004, if we measure in the current time, how well economically countries are doing around the world, whether they're Christian or Islamic or tribal faith, or whether they're within the Christian community Protestant, meaning protest, or are they Catholic or the Eastern Orthodox. If we look at that, we find some amazing things. We find that Protestants, by several factors, countries in which Protestant beliefs are the strongest, by several factors, have the most productive economies. They use the most energy, they spend the most money, they have the most stuff. And in some ways this is a little ironic because, of course, early Christianity taught people to give all their stuff away, live as one in a communal situation. Early Christianity taught that you should, that it was harder for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to get through the eye of an needle. And so the rich man came to Christ in the story and said, hey, what can I do? I've done everything. I've tried to help. I've tried to be a nice person. I've lived a good life. What can I do to get into heaven? And Christ looked at him and says, hey, give away all your stuff. And the guy goes, can't do that, and walks away. Well, how does Christianity get from that viewpoint to the viewpoint that you should be wealthy, that God wants you to prosper, that God wants you to have lots of stuff? Well, if we look at the amount of money that the average citizen in a Protestant country has, and then you compare it to the amount of money a person in an average Catholic country has, it literally is about 5 times less in the average Catholic country than a Protestant. If you look at the average Islamic country, it literally is, is 20 times less in the average Islamic country than the average Protestant country. One of the reasons that terrorism has been fostered there, because many of them don't feel like they've gotten their fair share of the modern pie. In a tribal-based nation, it's much less than that, in fact. It's like 100 times less amount of stuff that they have. So there's some, at least, correlation between belief systems and the amount of material possessions people have. Well, let's go to a trial that occurred in Boston. And I think this was somewhere around 1644. And it was one Protestant minister being tried. He was a Protestant minister now in the United States of America. And he was being tried because he had made a large profit off some of the things he invested in. And across town, while this trial was going on, another Protestant minister was not only denouncing King, the Protestant minister who had made a profit, in other words, he had committed the sin of capitalism, but he was telling exactly what was wrong.
I'm Dr. Barbara Walters, and I would like to welcome you to this brief podcast on Max Weber, the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. This represents one of the most important and certainly the best known of Max Weber's many, many books. Here, Weber explores the transformative psychology and inner bonding, the elective affinity, connecting the Protestant ethic and the spirit behind the emergence of market economies. This is a non-deterministic explanation and an interpretive study that exemplifies Weber's use of ideal types and his comparative historical method. Max Weber, unlike Karl Marx, believed that capitalism was a superior social system for enhancing human freedom and economic productivity. The key question he raises in The Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism is, why did capitalism emerge in Western Europe as opposed to somewhere else? This launched a set of unfinished comparative studies on religions in China, India, Islam, and Judaism, and so we began our exploration of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. The next set of slides, and there are 4 of them, depict various artistic renditions of belief systems in our final end as something that extends beyond our natural end. So the first is Michelangelo. Next, Jacob de Bakker. Third, a later painting by Vermeer.
A happy rhythm kicks off a Sunday prayer in Beijing Haidian Christian Church. Not a single seat is empty. Some of them are students seeking God before seeking a job.
It's always necessary to find God. Whatever my future studies or work, or when I build a family, God will be the one I can rely on.
While most Chinese parents tend to take their children to special classes, these parents bring their toddlers to church. This couple have come with their daughter, and a second child is on the way.
I want to bring up my children to revere God when they're young. It is more important than making them learn pianos or English. It will accompany them through a whole life.
In this church alone, 8,000 people come to pray on Sundays. The religion is growing rapidly in China. An official figure says 2.4 million Chinese were baptized in Protestant churches in China during the 5 years between 2007 and 2012.
Senior Pastor Wei Ching has welcomed many people into the church. He says they include university professors, students, company employees, factory workers, and farmers.
In China's today's society, people want to establish friendly relationship with each other. Image love is playing a very significant role, and the church today can offer the love through Jesus Christ. I think that's one of the
I think and love to read the comments. I am Montagnard Jure, Indigenous. I'm Christian, Montagnard Indigenous Christian, persecuted by Vietnamese government. Please pray for us. Love Chinese brothers, sisters. Christian, God bless you. Chinese people are beautiful. This is so cool. I always marvel at Jesus Christ, Son of God. Yeah, what do you expect? There's, oh God, on and on about shitty Jesus. Did China cause the Protestant Reformation? Oh. Did China cause the Reformation?
One thing that should be strongly emphasized is that history should not be bunched into separate categories, but it's one big, long, parallel story of everything. Like how there were tiny mammoths in northeastern Russia when the pyramids were being built. But could we link ancient China to Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation?
Oh, the printing press.
Yes, I mean, that's exactly what this is about. So, how does this all work? First, we start off in northern China during the Song days.
Shut up, fuck up. What we're talking about is, did China cause the Protestant Reformation? Now, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in Asian studies or Chinese studies, but I have done at least one paper in Asian studies, and I remember they focused mainly on China. I can't remember whether or not I passed that paper. I may or may not have passed it. But a very interesting question. We looked at, I remember studying Chinese religion. Did China, but and like doing Chinese history and you know what they say and what they believe. And I think what they're trying to say is that from Marco Polo, supposedly Marco Polo went to China and brought back a lot of things, and I think if I remember correctly, he brought back the printing press, and the printing press allowed the Reformation to happen because the Bible, particularly Luther's Bible and his propaganda and other monographs and things that he wrote, were very, with the printing press you could print things very quickly and get them out, and they were accurately, before then you had to have a scribe or it was very slow and it wasn't as accurate from original to copy, but the printing press, and I think that's all they're going to say.
There have always been many various non-Chinese tribes, often referred to as the equivalent of barbarians by many in China, perhaps partially known for contributing to the fall of Rome later as the Huns. China's tactic for keeping these various clans at bay was the classic tactic of divide and conquer, just without necessarily the conquer part. Many Chinese officials would pay individual clans to go to war with each other, keeping them from mounting a devastating offense on the Chinese heartland. The wall helped a bit too, I guess. This wasn't really favorable for those living outside the border, and there have been attempts to unite the clans against China, all were thwarted with their leaders killed, until the year 1205, when someone named Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, I guess that's how it's pronounced, decided that he also had enough of this, and decided to unite the Mongol tribes against China. They quickly started conquering surrounding areas, including entering into China, and in just a few decades, the Song dynasty collapsed, and by 1271, the Mongols had established their own government, known as the Yuan dynasty, which is kind of feat considering they were also busy conquering the rest of the world. In the year 1279, the Mongols had established an empire from St. Petersburg to Guangzhou, and they used their huge sphere of influence to transfer people and knowledge around the realm, and effectively rebooted the old Silk Road trade system, allowing goods, people, ideas, and much more to once again easily travel between Europe and East Asia. Unfortunately, one thing that also travels easily when traveling is easy is disease, and the bubonic plague, starting out in Central Asia, eventually made its way into Europe, likely through Italian merchants running away from the siege of Kaffa in modern-day Ukraine. The disease then spread
Shut
from
up.
the 1940s.
See, somebody's brought that thing up. You forgot to mention about movable type and early form of printing invented in China during the Song dynasty. I'm finding it difficult to understand what he's saying because he's talking too fast and he's mumbling.
50s, through Italy and Constantinople, into almost all of Europe, except Poland. Poland's completely unaffected, killing between a third and half the population. Cities were temporarily deserted, and the feudal society that reigned Europe at the time couldn't function as an empire.
Fucking load of shit. Did China cause the Protestant Reformation? Christianity in China. China. Bill Clinton attends Protestant church service in China. China. The growth of Protestant Christianity in China. 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 Protestantism in China. Right, there's a history of Christianity in China. Yeah, but that's Protestant. I mean, Catholic.
The largest religion of the Western world, and China, the oldest nation of the East, have interacted many times through history, as they still do today. However, as you will see, the coexistence has often been tumultuous, with many unexpected events.
Christianity
The story of
in
Christianity in
China.
China begins with silk.
China.
The Roman Empire imported silk from China since about the 1st
China.
century AD. However, the rise of the Persian Sasanian Empire in the 3rd and 4th century, which was at war with
That's so
Rome,
fucking
broke the Silk Road,
disgusting.
and therefore the Empire. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian I of the Byzantine Empire decided to look for a solution.
Why Christianity is thriving in China today. Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center on Religion and Chinese Studies.
Why don't we get started? My name is Tom Banchoff. I see some familiar faces here. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. I'm delighted to welcome back to the center Feng-Gam Yang, an old friend and colleague who's spoken here before and is going to share some thoughts today on the very important and interesting topic of rising in China today. Those of you who know the center and our work know that one of our main areas of interest, religion in China, we have a postdoctoral fellowship program now in its 4th year, where we bring a very talented young scholar of religious studies from a Chinese institution to Georgetown for a year. Dr. Yu is here with us this year from Shanghai. We have a website that we're building out with the resources on religion in China and the United States, both English and Chinese, that will become a very important teaching tool at universities, even at the secondary school level, both in China and in the U.S., to build knowledge of both societies about our societies and about some of the differences and challenges that we face. And we've had a running dialogue now for 3 years with the State Administration for Religious Affairs in China, alternating meetings here at Georgetown and in Beijing to discuss some of the key issues in our bilateral relationship in the spirit of openness, and those have been very productive exchanges. There's probably no scholar in the world better positioned to address these issues than Feng-Gam Yang. He's known to you, I think, as a professor of sociology and as director of the Center on Religion and Chinese Society at Purdue. He's a leading scholar of religion in China, but also works on immigrant religion in the United States. I'll just list a couple of his more recent books: State Market in Religions and Chinese Societies, which he co-edited in 2005, and his book forthcoming with Oxford University Press. It's not out yet, is it? Not quite. Entitled this titled story is China, the Future of Christianity. And the subtitle said, with the state now actively financing Christianity, China could well become the largest Christian country in the world. Quite sensational. But one thing, it clearly shows a European perspective. For religion to grow, you have to get the state support. But that's actually not true in China. Christianity has been growing in China despite government restrictions and suppression. So it's not because of the backing of the government. So that's what I try to explain. I'll skip the historical development of Christianity in China. Actually, there's archaeological evidence shows that Christianity could have arrived in China in the 1st century. But there's some historians and archaeologists are working on this. I'll just skip all of this, fast forward to today. Christianity in the People's Republic of China. That was beginning in 1949. Actually, there are four clearly different phases of development. Between 1949 and 1966, I think one word to capture the relationship between the Christian church and the state is suppression. And then followed by eradication, or elimination